I'd like to call the meeting to order, please. I'd like to call the meeting to order. Okay, we are just finishing up the briefing notes, and then we're going to go to general questions. We'll see how quick that goes. So we are on page 16 of the new blue sheets. Just like, yeah, so that we're now, I know there was some questions. I'll go through. So we have Office of the Chief Financial Officer and Treasurer. Response to EX 8.22, proposed budget changes to remove systematic barriers to hiring people with disabilities. Were there any questions on that? I didn't think so when we asked prior to lunch. Just want to make sure there was none on that. Finance, I think there was a question. Finance and Treasury Services, contributions to and withdrawals from the reserve funds. Oh, I thought there was questions. Okay, there is not. Well, it's 1:45, so. Office of the Chief Financial Officer and Treasurer, TTC subsidy period 2014 to 20. Okay, City Manager, so but now to City Manager. I don't think there were questions, but let me just run through it anyway. City Manager's Office, investing in resilience, impact of provincial government funding and policy changes. Okay. And I don't know, so Toronto, number 36, Toronto Transit Commission, new TTC service and capacity improvements. That briefing note. Okay. 37 and, so Toronto Public Library, there's 2, 37, 38. Toronto Public Library 2014 to 20, history of funding, and Toronto Public Library Sunday service increases. Councillor Perks, yeah, I thought you had some questions. Okay, so we'll go to those two items.
Thank you. So the Toronto Public Library board met last night, and at that, the board took the position that we should advocate with all members of the Budget Committee and Council to get the full implementation of the open hours program and the youth hubs. Is that correct? Who's answering my questions?
That is correct.
That was unanimous vote of the board.
Yes, it was.
And we also were given, and I don't know if you can recall it, some examples of the value that extending those hours and putting in youth hubs have had in communities. Can you share a little bit of that with us?
Yes, I can. There's been a history of good news stories that come out of all of our youth hubs, even in branches that just having the youth hub there tends to attract youth. We have two examples just relatively recently, unfortunately, where there were incidences outside of a branch, for example, but the youth involved in that incident knew that the library was a safe space, knew that the youth librarians were there, knew the youth hubs were there, and the reaction to the incident outside was to enter the branch, which obviously is very helpful for the youth hub to be there and for the library to be open.
And to engage with the staff that we have.
To engage with the staff.
What is the amount, so with the open hours, going back 2 years or a year, the library had said, let's complete the open hours in 3 phases, and that was the proposal. Council turned down the implementation of phase 1, and so I believe the ask was this year, let's make up for lost time, and the ask was to fund both phase 1 and phase 2. Is that correct?
That's correct.
What was the value of that?
The total value of the plan is $18.3 million. Let me just verify what just phases 1 and 2 are. Phases 1 and 2, the 2020 portion of it is $5.1 million.
So we were asking for 5.1, and all of that was turned down.
That's correct.
And how many youth hubs, additional youth hubs, did the board ask for?
The budget submission this year asked for 2 new youth hubs, both of which were recommended in
They were included, but not the open hours. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions on those two briefing notes? Okay, next is the Toronto Police Services Board Neighborhood Community Officer Program. I didn't think there were questions on that. Okay. Next, page 18. These are briefing notes submitted on January 15th, 2020. Are there any, I just want, any questions on any of those? I'll run through them. Inflationary changes, existing user fees, including the 2020 staff recommended budget, with social development finance, equity impacts of changes in the 2020 operating budget, corporate real estate, report back on building net zero buildings, city managers, again, strategic corporate policy, percentage-based budgeting for accountability offices, Toronto Community Housing Corporation, funding of Office of Ombudsman, and meeting the preconditions for ranked ballot elections, work plan, and budget. I don't recall seeing any questions on that, but I just want to throw it out there anyway. Okay. And then I do have, now I will go through briefing notes expected to be here next week, February 4th. There's one, and these will be coming. There's one on the Housing Secretariat. No, anyway, I don't have to read all of them. They are there. So as soon as they are in, they will be transmitted to councillors once they are completed.
So just
questions on those?
Just to confirm, the outstanding briefing notes will be coming to the next wrap-up.
Maybe, is it possible to get a comment on that?
Through the chair, the expectation is that they'll be ready for the February 4th meeting.
Okay.
We're continuing to move on finalizing them all.
Okay, so that is all the blue pages. Correct, Steve? Okay, great. So what we're going to do now, we're going to go on to just overall questions. I'm sensing most of the questions were probably asked and answered during the briefing note segment. So you have the pages in front of you. Community and Social Services. I believe there was a question, Councillor Perks. You were talking about the Housing Secretariat. You want to ask a question?
Yes, and again, it's one of these ones where it's not 100% clear which division it should be, but I'm choosing this as a convenience because it's the nearest thing I can find. It's questions about the role of the Housing Commissioner. So in the housing plan that came to council, there was a motion passed. I forget the exact wording, but it was basically to accelerate the creation of the Housing Commissioner role. Is my memory correct about that? I don't even know who should.
To the chair, that's correct. Council directed the city manager to establish the role or function of a housing commissioner in 2020 and requested the city manager to report to council by Q3 with options for the function to independently assess the implementation of the revised Toronto Housing Strategy Charter and the new 10-year plan.
Okay. And I'm correct also that I can't find a budget line in here that puts any money towards that, like to actually establish the office.
That's correct. Until we assess the options and form our recommendations for council consideration, and we're going to try and do that before the end of Q2, with the intent that to establish the office of 2020, if additional resources are required, we would work with the CFO to temporarily possibly use a reserve to initiate it in 2020 and then put the full annual ongoing funding costs into the 2021 budget submission.
Into the 2021 budget. Okay, so is the reserve identified?
I would most likely look to SSHA and their housing reserve. We have a social housing reserve, but
look, they're
I haven't
smiling so
evaluated.
happily over there.
I haven't evaluated all of the options yet.
Okay, so maybe to housing staff, are you protecting for an amount in the housing reserve to make it available so that we can do 2020 implementation?
We have sufficient funds in the reserve to cover.
I'm sorry, I'm very sorry. Could you start again?
Yeah, we have sufficient funds in the reserve at this point to cover those expenses.
Okay.
Because it will only be part year.
Yeah, no, and I understand that. And my concern is if we don't put something in part year here, we get into the 21 budget cycle. And because, from the time council approves the budget until the time you can go through HR and blah, 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 we'd lose not only all of 2020, but half of 21 as well. That's what would happen if we didn't protect for it, right?
Oh, to the chair, our intent would be to follow council direction and initiate that function in 2020. It's hard for us to determine what that annual cost would be until we've analyzed all the options, but we would look to using some type of one-time funding in 2020 to actually establish the office, and then through the 2021 budget process, it would just be a matter of building into the base.
Okay, so I'm a belts and suspenders kind of guy. And I know that when we approve the budget, we actually approve like hundreds. No, I'm both, Mike. Anyway, when we approve the budget, we're actually approving like hundreds of little clauses saying, do this with this money, do that with this money, and so on and so forth. Given that it is everybody's understanding that there will be sufficient money in the SSHA reserve, and that the intention is that at a minimum, that's the backstop, could someone prepare for me language so the motion can be moved so that that is formally acknowledged in the budget that we pass at council this year?
So, to the chair, yes, I will prepare a motion, but I would also consult with the CFO to make sure that we're accessing the correct reserve.
And I'm sure you'll do all that work, as long as something is in our hands when we get to the budget debate, so that there are no mistakes and oversight, and we don't wind up halfway into the year going, oh golly, we didn't really protect for this, we can't do it. Fair enough?
Fair enough.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. In that section, Community and Social Services, any other questions? I don't recall when I think we were good with that. Okay. Infrastructure and Development Services, were there any questions? I don't recall any. I just wanted to confirm one more time. Corporate Services, questions? Finance and Treasury Services?
Sorry,
Oh,
just on
Councillor
that.
Layton?
I'll ask Fleet just quickly. In order to fully implement our green fleet strategy in 2020, what do you need?
Through you, Mr. Chair, as identified in Appendix 4 and 7, for the new and enhanced, there is some funding and staffing required for implementation.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Finance and Treasury Services. I believe so, yes. So Councillor Perks on the outside first.
Okay. I'm going to try to do this without stealing all of Councillor Carroll's thunder.
I don't have any thunder.
Oh, you have thunder, my
It's just
sister.
light precipitation.
So, in our deliberations to date, I've observed a couple of things. One is that we have a housing plan which requires us to find about $8 billion in City of Toronto money that is not currently budgeted. The other is that we have, depending on what time scale you look at it, about $24 billion in state of good repair work that we have to do for the TTC, and we don't have enough funding, even with the city building fund, to carry our share of that. Further, that in some departments, the state of good repair backlog, this is exclusive of TTC, will grow dramatically. Transportation, for example, will grow from 1 billion to 4. Similar things could be said about PF&R, for example. Given all of those needs, and given that it has been, to my memory, 16 years since the city has had a long-term financial plan, what advice can you offer to council about how we meet that long-term need?
Through the chair. I'm just going to reflect back on the presentation that we launched the budget this year. And if you recall, the strategy around partnerships was emphasized. That was also brought up in the VBOR report. And what we've been trying to convey is the fact that we actually aren't in a position to tax our way out of the requirements, and that there is a need for partnerships, whether that be with other levels of government and whether that be with the private sector. We are looking at what are the opportunities and solutions to develop those partnerships and to address the needs. So when we talk about the state of good repair and the TTC, or the state of good repair on the roads, we know from a regional perspective that the demands put on the systems are not caused only by Torontonians, but by areas that surround Toronto. So we are looking at solutions that will involve other parties.
So to be clear, what you're telling me is that the $8 billion that we are supposed to have from the city, because we're already assuming 16 from other orders of government for our affordable housing project, and that the unfunded portion of the city's responsibility for state of good repair, because it's clear we're not going to get 100% out of other orders of government, and the $3 billion growth in the state of good repair backlog just for transportation, your assertion is that we can solve those problems by partnerships?
Through the chair, what I am suggesting is that we will look at multiple solutions to solve the problem. There isn't one solution that is going to solve this issue, these issues, and that we are looking for partnerships. So if you think back to where we were a year ago, we did not have a partnership with the federal government for social housing. A year ago,
No, I want to be very clear. On the housing side, we're assuming, even though the money isn't in hand, that we are getting $16 billion from other orders of government. There's $8 billion that is supposed to be our share. You can't say that the federal government is going to pick up their share and our share. What is the city's strategy for picking up our share there, our share on TTC, and our state of good repair backlog on roads, which quite frankly, no other government in either the GTA or federally or provincially will pick up? What is our strategy for those holes?
So through the chair, with regards to the social housing, I'm sorry, I don't know where you're getting your $8 billion number. I'm looking
From the
at
city
my
staff
colleagues.
report.
Through the chair, on the $8.5 billion on housing, approximately $5.5 billion of that is actually currently funded within our program.
Well, I think the point remains. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Carroll, do you still have questions?
I do, thank you. When I look at financial services, we're actually investing a lot of time and money into this recasting of capital. So I have some questions to ask because we tend to pour over operating and then quickly look at capital is my word in there. I'm done. It's just the nature of the way we see things. But I'm looking at what the city building fund will do for us going forward. We had great fun with it yesterday in the TTC. We're way better off now. So it's really a welcome investment. But I'm wondering how it will be accounted for by finance and planning going forward. For the first few years, I'm assuming you're going to do what we saw at launch. At launch, we were told what our debt target is and what our debt ceiling is, and it was our debt ceiling not including the city building fund. At what point does that become so cumulative and in the budget that we count it as part of the envelope and we actually look at our true debt ceiling?
So through the chair, I just want to clarify why it's not included in there. And when we have recoverable debt, that means we have a reliable source of income that services 100% of the debt, then it's not brought into the overall debt service calculation. And so when we think of the city building fund, we are charging a levy that will in turn be 100% used to finance related debt. So the city building levy will in actual fact be the amount that will service $6.6 billion in debt, which is why it's not included in our debt service ratio.
So when you don't include it in the chart that shows us the debt service ratio so that we know that we're not at our ceiling for serving the debt. So if I said to you, what's our debt right now? Do you give me two numbers, or do you or is the work we're going to do with the city building fund captured in that? What if I say, how much debt are we gonna incur this year?
So through the chair, we can give you our total debt number, and then we look at the type of debt that we actually have. And with regards to the city building fund, we will be tracking that particular debt specifically because of the levy and
Separate it out.
Yes.
Okay, okay. So at what point in time do we start to look at, okay, we now have that in there as a cumulative total. This is what we are going to collect from residents year after year after year. The overall envelope is now bigger. We're going to collect it every year thereafter. At some point, it becomes a part of the base of what we collect from residents. Do we then shift how we account for it?
So through the chair, I don't think we would actually reflect it as a base amount that we collect from residents because it does have a start date and it has an end date.
So at the end of the end date, are people's property tax bills going to drop back down?
Through the chair, hypothetically, if the city building fund sunsets, then there would not be that additional levy in addition to the property tax.
But are we going to then knock the rate back down and not include what we've now begun to collect from them?
So through the chair, we're actually not, it's an additional levy, so we wouldn't be knocking any rate down. It wouldn't be, the additional levy would be sunset. We would not be charging the additional levy any further.
Right, so we won't do any further levying, but those dollars are now built into the base of what we're going to collect every year. Will we then begin to account for it differently when we show it in budget documents?
So through the chair, and I just want to clarify that it is not built into how much we're collecting every year. That amount is specifically being put aside to fund debt.
Correct, but when we get through the program, the multi-year program, are we going to stop collecting it and the bill gets smaller, or are we going to say we're now at a new dollar level and we're going to stay there?
So through the chair, I can't project what's going to happen, but
Because that'll be a political decision?
Through the chair, so the debt itself is going to support recoverable debt over the next 30 years with probably an additional 10 years to actually incur those costs. So those are decisions that would be made 40 years from today. I think in terms of the funds that were collected, again, as the CFO had mentioned, we're going to collect those funds and ensure that we've got them separated out from the other revenue sources that we collect and track their usage in support of the recoverable debt.
Okay, that's your last question.
Okay. Oh, that was my last question? I can't ask the one more?
Quickly.
Okay, so the last question, and it's the question I'm going to ask again at council, so we might as well practice here today. Can I get, so that we know it every year, what is our debt per capita ratio, including all of the debt of that year, and what it will be in subsequent years? So that we have one place where it's all rolled in together and we really know our solvency while we're doing the budget, not months later when we look at our financial statement, those of us who look at them. Can we get that, like by the time we're in council?
through the chair, yes, we can.
Okay,
That'd be excellent, thank you.
thank you. Any other questions? Councillor Layton?
Yes, thank you very much. When can we expect the report on the vacant home tax to?
Through the chair, there is a requirement to report back to council, and the specific date has to be determined. We, as you know, or I think you know, there was a consultant hired to help inform the information, and a draft report is near completion.
So could we expect at least a briefing note to give us some high-level thoughts to come back to the Budget Committee prior to next week's wrap-up?
We will look at what we have available, yes.
Okay. Is there any idea and early thoughts on the quantum for the annual revenue from a source like a vacant home tax?
Through the chair, at this point, I can't speculate.
So, like, not even like, is it in the tens of millions? Is it hundreds of millions? Is it?
I think, Councillor, she said that she can't speculate, so it's kind of a leading question.
Well, if we took the number from Vancouver, do you know what the Vancouver annual revenue is? Can we extrapolate what that would mean in the context of Toronto?
So through the chair, I think there's several assumptions that have to be addressed in the sense of what it's going to be applied to, what the rate's going to be, how it's going to be applied, what year it's going to start. There's several assumptions that I don't have Vancouver's numbers with me.
Okay.
But that would also be assuming that we are going to use the same assumptions that they do to apply to ours. So again, it's too difficult to.
So we do have a report on the commercial parking levy. At least we have data on that, correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. We had 2 consultants write reports for us, so I
that's
imagine they're still, like, at least somewhat relevant. How long would it take to implement a commercial parking levy?
Through the chair, Councillor, I'd have to get back to you. I don't know that off the top of my head.
A vehicle registration tax, do you know how long that would take to implement?
No, sorry.
Okay. Do you know what the amount would be, or what the range?
Unfortunately, I don't have that information with me right now, but happy to bring it up.
Could I suggest that you do bring that to the next meeting, because that's all readily available from consultants' reports as frequent or as recently as 2 years ago. The range for the commercial parking levy, the range for the VRT, the time it would take to implement them are all readily available information. And given
Happy to do that. I don't have it right now.
given the information we've just had on the state of good the state of good repair backlog, like, I think we are going to be talking about, clearly we are going to be talking about tools for raising the revenue necessary if we're serious about actually solving this budget hole. And so I think we need to make sure that the numbers in that report can get reported out. Thank you.
Thank you. Seeing no more questions, okay, we will go on now to, I don't recall a lot of questions on these, but other, which is city manager, legal services, city clerk, city council, office of the mayor. I don't think there were questions on that prior. There were none for the accountability officers. With regard to the agencies, I do recall there was a question on Toronto Transit, on TTC. Are there questions on, I will assume there's no other questions, anything else? Are there any questions, final questions on the TTC? Okay, seeing none. We are now at, first of all, I want to, by the way, thank staff, all the incredible work that they did. I just want to for all the work, being here and all that, so I want to thank you on that. We are now in the, I guess, with speaking whatever as part of the wrap-up. There's 2 wrap-ups. There's an opportunity for any outside councillors to speak, so choosing. or you can speak next week, or speak next week. I'll keep you in suspense. Okay. So I'll take it into committee. I'm going to be moving a motion that consideration of the item be deferred until the February 4th, 2020 meeting of Budget Committee. So deferral is on the floor.
Wait, I had, at the beginning of the meeting, you said we could introduce motions at this point in time, that we wouldn't vote on them, but we could.
Motions are in order to be moved. Deferral has to be voted on first, and then after that, we can.
I'm sorry, you opened the meeting with saying we'd have an opportunity to introduce motions. I spent a good 3 hours today pulling motions together. I just don't see why you couldn't have just said, I'm going to recommend referring the item, rather than saying, rather than now changing what the course would be.
So I'm just trying to, are there questions of the mover? Is that what you're,
Sure, I'll question the mover, that why, it could have, you could have just as easily told us that we weren't moving motions today because you were going to defer the item, rather than say the exact opposite, that we could introduce motions and now be changing.
So Council, first of all, deferral is in order. There is an opportunity to move motions next week, absolutely, as we have done in past years.
I will speak against the deferral.
Everyone will have opportunity to move motions next week.
I'll speak against the
Councilor
deferral.
Carroll, questions? Or do you want to speak? Or do you want to speak to the
I'm
deferral?
wondering if are we not understanding that one can table motions, they can become attached to the item, and the motions can be deferred with the item? Wouldn't we rather know what people are planning on moving so we can?
No, he wants it as a surprise at the
that
end
is
of the next
possible.
meeting.
So if it's a question to me, we have in past years, actually, there was, at this point in the process, there were no motions until final. But I did have to state there is a right to do that. But there is a right for me to speak first and to move a deferral motion. Everyone will have the right to do motions next week.
Yeah.
So
Okay, so
speaking to
I
deferral?
think I heard a ruling on my point of order. Put me down to speak.
Okay. Speakers to deferral, I believe it's 2 minutes. Councillor Carroll first, and then Council.
So, you know, I was raising the procedural point that we have in the past, while there is an intention to defer a motion, we could table, or to defer an item, that we could table motions and they could travel along with that deferred item so that staff had a chance to know what was up the councillor's sleeve and perhaps act on it, inform on it, so that when we get to wrap up, we're better prepared. I would submit that that's a better way to proceed from the staff perspective. That I would think they would want to know what the motions might be. And as you've just stated, you are duty bound to inform us that we have the right to do that. Why would you now deny the right to do it, having informed us that we do have the right to do it? I'm going to have to vote against deferral if we're not going to give councillors their rights. There's no harm in doing it.
Councillor Layton.
So I'm a bit at a loss for words here, because up until this point, I think we've all tried to really work together to move this budget process forward efficiently and fairly. And this meeting opened up. In fact, there was a briefing yesterday. I wasn't there because I was at home with a sick child, but I was told that there would be an opportunity to advance motions at this meeting. I prepared motions to advance at this meeting, to be honest, for nothing more than to get them off my plate. Other councillors took motions that were written by staff and brought them to me to introduce now so we wouldn't have to worry about them. And then again at the beginning of this meeting, we were reminded of that fact. So I rushed about trying to get my motions prepared, all A through J. And then at the chair's first opportunity to go against the advice he set out to at the beginning of the meeting, which he could have indicated at any point in time throughout this meeting, why this sudden, very disingenuous referral or deferral without any courtesy to your colleagues. I would ask anyone else sitting in the committee that if such a strategic and calculated move, which could have been indicated earlier today, was going to happen, if they would think that that's acceptable, if it was them in the same shoes I'm in. I just think it's very disingenuous and unfair and really against, I think, the atmosphere that's been created in this room up until this point. I'm at a loss.
Thank you. Any other speakers? Seeing none, the deferral motion.
I'll ask for a recorded vote.
All in favor of deferral till February 4th?
All in favor of the deferral, Councillor Crawford, Councillor Bradford, Councillor Nunziata, Councillor McKelvey, all opposed. Councillor Carroll, Councillor Layton, that passes.
Thank you. We are, I don't know if we're adjourned or in recess till next week.
Adjourned.
We're adjourned till next week. Thank you.